You say the great unraveling has begun. And you say, never in my lifetime have I sensed so much unrest in the air. And it seems that every day brings another set of unsettling headlines. And you say, everywhere I go, I hear people saying that they expect something is about to happen, but they don't know what it is. And I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. But how do you reassure your flock about our times, be it your TV flock, radio flock, your church? How do you comfort them in times like this?
Well, I read a liberal blog yesterday that was just criticizing me left and right, but it had a funny comment in it. This writer said Dr. Jeffress ought to get the award for the most scary words in a single book title. Countdown to the apocalypse, ISIS, and Ebola are only the beginning. And yet, Jan, here's the hope. That word apocalypse is not a scary word for Christians.
That's right.
As you know, the word apocalypse comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, the revelation. It's the last book of the Bible. It's about the revelation, the revealing of Jesus Christ. And so all of these terrible things that are happening right now, they are just the ramp up, if you will, to the return of Jesus Christ, which is good news for every believer.
That's right.
And, Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25, he describes these things that will precede his return as birth pangs, labor pains. And every woman who's pregnant has a general idea of when she's going to give birth, but when those pains begin to increase in intensity and frequency, she knows she's about to give birth to something dramatic. And that's what's happening here. In a sense, these signs have been here for a long time, and yet what I see happening is that they are increasing in frequency and intensity, and that means something big's going to happen. Now, you and I, of course, believe in a rapture of the church that will happen before this final 7 years. But I think every day that passes is moving us toward this period of time that Jesus called the last days.
You write a lot about the last days, and particularly in the 2 books that my ministry happens to carry here. And you remind people that knowing the future ought to make a big difference in the way we live today. But here are 3 problems I see, and I want your comment. There are too few who know the future. There are too few who even want to know the future. And too many pastors are putting the topic down, calling it divisive, irrelevant, let's just live for today, etc. So those are the hurdles you and I have to jump over to get this message out.
Well, that's true. And I talk about that, Jan, in the first chapter of my book, Countdown to the Apocalypse, because many Christians have raised eyebrows when you start talking about Bible prophecy. And I talk about in my book 3 extremes to avoid in the subject of Bible prophecy. One is fanaticism. That is the attempt to set the date of Christ's return, which Matthew 24:36 we cannot do. Christopher Columbus thought the world would end in 1656. Martin Luther thought the world couldn't last 300 years past his own death. And I just say, anytime you hear somebody say, I know we're not supposed to set dates, but you need to really be careful of listening to those kind of fanatics. Another extreme is fatalism. And that's really what I see more among Christians today, Jan. It's the idea, well, the end's going to come. There's nothing we can do about it. We'll just sit on our blessed assurances and wait for the Lord to return. We need to be active, pushing back against evil, sharing the message of Jesus Christ with as many people as possible. But the final extreme is the one that is probably the most prevalent in the church, and that's cynicism when it comes to Bible prophecy. Oh, people have been saying this forever, and nothing has changed. That's the message of 2 Peter 3. Peter said, in the last days, scoffers will come with their scoffing, saying, where is the promise of his coming? And I remind people who say, like you alluded to, that, we shouldn't talk about Bible prophecy. That's God's business. It's divisive. Remember in Matthew 24, when the disciples said to the Lord, Lord, what shall be the signs of your coming and the end of the age? He didn't say mind your own business. He didn't say just concentrate on your relationship with me and leave the other stuff to God. Instead, he gave them a very detailed scenario of the events that will lead to his return. He wanted people to know about the events that would lead to his return. And he said, when you see these things begin to take place, look up because your redemption draws near.
Folks, you can get this little book, and it's a short one, so you can read it in probably one sitting, Countdown to the Apocalypse, Why ISIS and Ebola Are Only the Beginning. Olive Tree Views, views as in viewpoint, olivetreeviews.org. Just go to our store. You can learn more about Dr. Jeffress at ptv.org, stands for Pathway to Victory, ptv.org. He'll be with us this fall, along with Pastor Jack Hibbs, Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, who has now stepped down from Congress, of course, Amir Sarfati, who is an Israeli prophecy teacher and Homeland Security specialist, all of that October 2nd and 3rd, just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Dr. Jeffress, you say this, you warn against citing a single event as being a huge marker in trying to discern our times, or eschatology particularly, and not to take one headline or a few news stories and build a case around them, because you have said signs have been present in every generation, but then you do go on to spend a fair amount of pages on ISIS in Bible prophecy. Can you give me a summary of how you see ISIS in Bible prophecy?
First of all, you really cannot understand radical Islam, and ISIS is just a branch of radical Islam, and ISIS is a force that may or may not be defeated. But radical Islam, you cannot understand it until you go back 2,000 years past Muhammad and understand the original conflict started with the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac. God gave the promise of the land to Abraham, Isaac, and their descendants, and the descendants of Ishmael are the Arab nations today. Every Muslim leader today believes that Ishmael is his forefather. Muhammad believed that Ishmael was his spiritual forefather. And bottom line is, the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs, believe that the promise is rightfully theirs, and that little piece of real estate we call Israel really belongs to them. And as I've said repeatedly in the news, radical Islam will not rest until they have exterminated all of Israel, every Jew, and every person who supports the Jewish people, which includes the West. And all of this is moving, I believe, toward a great climactic conclusion during the tribulation, when the forces from the East, which I very well believe could be an amalgamation of Muslim nations, move against Israel. You know, Ezekiel 38 talks about a Muslim invasion of Israel during this last period of time. Ezekiel actually called out Iran by name. Of course, it was called Persia then. He mentions Syria. He mentions this amalgamation of Muslim nations that will invade Israel. In Revelation chapter 16, John pictured an army of 200 million, the kings of the East, moving from the East toward Israel. Jan, you and I remember when we used to think that was Red China.
Yes.
And yet today, the CIA Facebook lists India as having a military force beyond 200 million. When you combine that with the 98 million people available for military service in Muslim countries, you can see how this very well could be the fulfillment of what the book of Revelation talks about.